best stories are told around a campfire. Campfire stories, finding God in the flames. It's a very famous passage. It's an easy read. I was threatening last night to change it to something with many names and places, but I went easy on you. Father John Powell, a professor at Loyola University in Chicago, once shared a story about a particular student in his theology of faith class. The student's name was Tommy. Tommy turned out to be the atheist in residence in this faith class. He constantly objected to, smirked at, or whined about the possibility that there could be a loving Father God. Powell writes, "We lived with each other in relative peace for one semester, although I will admit that for me, he was at times a serious pain in the back pew. When he came up at the end of the course to turn in his final exam, he asked me in a cynical tone, 'Do you think that I will ever find God?' I decided instantly on a little shock therapy. 'No,' I said enthusiastically. 'Well, why not?' he responded. 'Isn't this the product that you're pushing?' I let him get 5 steps towards the classroom door, and then I called out, 'Tommy, I don't think that you'll ever find him, but I am absolutely certain that he will find you.' Tommy simply shrugged," Powell writes, "and left." Well, maybe you know somebody like Tommy. Maybe you are or have been someone like Tommy. The idea of an unconditional, loving God is just not something that you can swallow. And the reason for it is because no matter where you look, you just don't see God anywhere. In fact, I would wager that most of us who would consider ourselves faithful believers have found a time in our lives where no matter how hard we looked, it seemed like God had gone dark. Maybe that even describes you right now. If you haven't experienced this, I want you to be forewarned. It is normal to experience times in our lives where God feels absent. Maybe you have experienced an illness or a loss of some kind, or you have a choice to make and you're just not getting any direction, or you're simply looking out at the world and you wonder, how could a loving God have created all of this mess? Or maybe none of the above applies to you, and you simply, inexplicably, do not any longer enjoy the nearness to Christ that you once enjoyed. And you can't discern any reason for this detachment whatsoever. Well, 16th century mystic St. John of the Cross, he called this the dark night of the soul. A period in our lives where it feels like hope and even God himself is veiled from our darkened eyes. And of course, dear friends, there is only one way to dispel the darkness. In today's reading from Exodus 3, we encounter the great prophet Moses before he was the great prophet Moses. And I think that in this reading, he's experiencing his very own dark night of the soul. But before we can go there, we need to go back just a little bit. We need to set the scene for this iconic moment. Now, we all think of Moses as a great pillar of the faith. He is easily among the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets. I mean, think about this. He parted the Red Sea, right? He led his people through the wilderness to the edge of the promised lands. He communed on a mountain with God and received the Ten Commandments. He's so iconic that the only one who can play him is Charlton Heston himself. But at this point in the story, Moses is nothing like a hero of the faith. And the key to understanding his situation can be found in verse 1. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. While the Israelites were captives in Egypt, you might remember the story. Famously, he was rescued on this makeshift boat, and he was raised in Pharaoh's household, raised as an Egyptian, although he was Jewish by birth. And he saw Egyptians mistreating a fellow Jewish person, fellow Israelite, and what did he do? Well, he struck out in anger. He killed them. With a price on his head, Moses then fled from Egypt, and he arrived in a strange land called Midian. Now, one day while he was sitting by a well in Midian, a gaggle of sisters arrived to get water from this well for their father. But as they arrived there were some other shepherds, and those shepherds chased those sisters away because they wanted water before them. I think Moses had a very protective streak, and he stepped in to defend these sisters. And upon their return home, their father Reuel asked them, "How is it that you've come home so early?" And so they said, "Listen, we were attacked. This guy drove them off, helped us water our flock." And Reuel said, "This guy's a keeper. Where is he? Bring him home for supper." And that's exactly what they did. Things must have gone pretty well, because it wasn't too long before there were wedding bells, and he married Zipporah, one of the daughters, and became Moses' wife. Now, Reuel had another name. Sounds a little bit like Beverly Hillbillies, but his other name was Jethro. Jethro, and he was a priest among the Midianites, a spiritual leader. Now, not everybody knows this, but I don't need that one. It's going to be good, though, when it comes. Not everyone knows this, but the Midianites were descendants from Abraham's third wife. Remember Abraham, that great founding prophet? His third wife gave birth to a son, and these Midianites are descendants from that son. But they are not considered by Orthodox Israel as part of the covenant people. They're outsiders. They have, in many ways, different traditions, different theologies, different ways of looking at things. To put this into perspective, it would be sort of like the Baptist evangelist Billy Graham marrying a daughter of the Mormon high priest. There you go. There's Billy. They shared a common ancestry, but they ended up in very different places socially and theologically. So, to set the scene, Moses is a fugitive of the law. He's hiding in a foreign land, and he's married to the daughter of a Midianite priest. And it also says in verse 1 that he is out in the wilderness when this life-changing event goes down. In essence, dear church, he's run as far from God as he possibly could. And then he looked into the fire. To recap the story, we heard an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw the bush was on fire, but it didn't burn up. So he thought, I'll go over and see why this strange occurrence is happening. I have read that in the desert, under very, very dry conditions, it's not common, but it does happen that some of these dry bushes can spontaneously catch on fire in the right circumstances. So it happens. But what is very uncommon is that bush does not completely burn up. So rightly so, Moses investigates. When the Lord saw that he'd gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am. Here I am." Those 3 words changed Moses' life. And he could have said something different. He could have said, "Where were you back in Egypt when my people were suffering?" He could have said, "I don't want anything to do with you. I've come all this way to get away from you. Please leave me alone." He could have said, "I don't talk to strange bushes," and walked away. But he didn't. What did he say? "Here I am." You know, sometimes it's those 3 words that can make all the difference. Because the reality is that some of us feel like we can't hear God when in fact we've simply been running away from God. We've been hiding from God. Maybe we don't want to hear what he says. Maybe we're afraid of what he will say. Maybe we'd rather just live happy little lives tending sheep in the wilderness and just be left alone. But here's the thing. We can't hide forever. And I think Moses knew it. I think he knew that his time had come. "Here I am," he said. "Do not come any closer," God said in reply. "In fact, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." I've read this a million times and it always seemed a little strange to me. But something occurred to me this week as I was studying the passage. Did you catch that? The Israelites at this point in the story haven't reached the promised land. They don't own any holy ground. In fact, as slaves in Egypt, they don't own any unholy ground either. If you're looking for holy ground, you certainly wouldn't go looking for it in the wilderness in Midian. So what is God saying? What is he saying when he says, "Take off your sandals, you're standing here in the wilderness in Midian on holy ground"? I think he's saying, no matter how far you run from me, I will show up. And wherever I show up is a divine appointment. Whether it's in the wilderness, a Sunday service, a hospital room, a park bench, wherever God shows up to your church, that's holy ground. And then God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. We have to remember that Moses is a murderer who's run away to Midian. He has a reason for concern in the face of a just and holy God. The Lord continues, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." I can only imagine the confused look on Moses' face. He must have been expecting anything but this. Angry judgment, condemnation. He's so afraid he won't even look into the fire. But then God flips the script on Moses. "I see what's going on," God says. "I hear the prayers of the people," God says. "I'm going to do something about it," God says. And then he says the most terrifying thing of all. He says, "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I?" Well, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? God, you've got all of these big plans, but I'm not a big person. You have all these huge plans, but I feel very small. Has God ever called you to something big, but you felt so small that you just ignored it because you thought, who am I? It was too big, too uncomfortable, too scary. Now tell me, what happens? What happens to a person when they ignore God for long enough? What happens when you are afraid to look in the fire because you may not like what you see? I'll tell you, after a while, you get so good at not looking for God that you stop seeing God altogether. The fire recedes in the periphery, and there is only darkness. But there's good news to the story. There's good news to the story. If the story teaches us anything, it is that no matter how hard you try to hide, no matter how far you run away, God will never, and I mean never, He will never stop showing up for you. After all, just listen to what He said to Moses next. He said, "I will be with you. Just like I am here right now with you, Moses. Just like I came this far to find you, no matter where you go, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God. You will worship me on this mountain." And they did. No matter how hard you try to hide, I want you to hear this, church. God will never stop showing up for you. And I think this is exactly what Father Powell had in mind when he said to his atheist student, "I don't think you'll ever find Him, but I'm absolutely certain that God will find you." Because the God of Moses is the God who shows up in places we don't expect. And we all know, as we read the New Testament, that the Good Shepherd leaves the 99 to seek and to save the lost. Well, as it turns out, Father Powell kept low-key tabs on Tommy. When Tommy graduated, he quietly noted that and was well pleased with that. Not long after, he heard the sad news. Tommy, a young man, had terminal cancer. Before Father Powell could search him out, Tommy actually came to see his former professor. I want to read you what Father Powell writes about that encounter. He says, "When he walked into my office, his body was very badly wasted and his hair had fallen out because of chemotherapy. But his eyes were bright and his voice was firm for the first time since I'd known him. Tommy, I thought about you so many times. I hear you're sick," he blurted out. "Oh yes, very sick. I have cancer in both lungs. The doctors tell me it's a matter of weeks. But I want to talk to you," Tom said, "about something you said to me on the last day of class. I asked you if you thought I would ever find God, and you said no, which surprised me. And then you said, but He will find you. I thought about that a lot, even though my search for God was hardly intense at the time. But when the doctors removed a lump from my groin and told me it was malignant, that's when I got serious about trying to locate God. And when the malignancy spread into my vital organs, I really began banging bloody fists against the bronze doors of heaven. But God did not come out. In fact, nothing happened. Did you ever try anything for a long time with great effort and with no success. You get psychologically gutted, fed up with trying, and then you just quit. Well, one day I woke up, and instead of throwing a few more futile appeals over that high brick wall to a God who may or may not be there, I just quit. I just decided that I didn't really care about God or the afterlife or anything like that, and I decided to spend that time I had left doing something more profitable. So I began with my dad. My dad was reading the newspaper when I approached him. "Dad?" "Yes, what?" he asked without lowering the newspaper. "Dad, I want to talk to you." "Well, talk. I mean, it's really important." The newspaper came down 3 slow inches. "What is it?" "Dad, I love you, and I just want you to know that." Tom smiled at me, Powell writes, and said it with obvious satisfaction as though he felt a warm and secret joy flowing inside of him. Tommy said the newspaper fluttered to the floor. And then my father did 2 things I could never remember him ever doing before. He cried, and he hugged me. We talked all night, all through the night, even though he had to go to work the next morning. It felt so good to be close to my father, to see his tears, to feel his hug, to hear him say that he loved me. It was easier with my mother and my little brother. They cried with me too, and we hugged each other, and we said really nice things to each other. We shared the things we had been keeping secret for so long. I was only sorry of one thing, that I had waited so long to tell them. Here I was just beginning to open up to the people I had actually been close to, and my time was coming to an end. And then one day, I turned around, and God was there. He didn't come to me when I pleaded with him. I guess that I was kind of like an animal trainer holding out a hoop and say, "God, jump through this hoop. You got 3 days, you got 3 weeks to prove yourself to me." Apparently, Tommy says, God does things in his own way and at his own hour. But the important thing is that he was there. He found me. You were right, Professor. He found me even after I stopped looking for him. You know, church, it's funny. God can often show up in unexpected places and in unexpected ways. Even in Midian, in the wilderness, in a burning bush. The most important thing to remember is that he will show up. And when he does, there are only 3 words that you need to say. Here I am. For there's only one way to dispel the dark night of the soul, and that is to find God in the fire. So when you do find God in the fire, whether it happens in a car, or in a nursing home, or at work, or the superstore, make sure you take off your shoes. For when he shows up, you will be standing on holy ground.